People, we avoided it for this long, but unfortunately it drew us back in. The MCU is officially back in theaters with the movie, the traditional format. We're here to discuss the long-delayed Black Widow. It has been delayed 5 times, I think. I think was the last count that I kept track of since what was supposed to be its initial release date way back in May of 2020. Man, remember what we were doing in May of 2020? Chris, you ready to be back with the MCU and movies after the last 5 months of TV shows?
Thrilled, man. I'm so excited to be here right now. You have no idea.
Okay, we'll get into that and more. Stay tuned. All right, so I'm not gonna lie here. This is a little bit of a surreal experience for me, right? Because like the thing about the Fast and the Furious movies was that was that we'd already I was already so used to like there being long gaps of time in between movies. Like sometimes like the trajectory of being a Fast and Furious fan in the first half of the 2010s was something we kind of had to get used to, because there would be like 2 years in between movies, and we would only get 1 movie a year. As MCU fans, we were spoiled. By the time the MCU like ended, at least its first 3 phases right before the pandemic started, we were used to like we were coming off 3 years straight in a row of 3 movies every couple of months, you know? And then we had the pandemic, and we had a full year of no MCU content, which in hindsight was probably the best thing that could have happened for them, because by the time they came back this year, it made people even more desperate and starving. They're like vampires coming out being like, I need my MCU content. I need you. I don't care about anything else. I need that MCU content. And we were beyond spoiled at the beginning of this year. First with WandaVision, 9 episodes straight, then 6 episodes of Falcon and Winter Soldier. We're just about to wrap up Loki, 1 episode left of that. And now we're getting back to like the originals, right? We're getting back to the origin of where the MCU started, right? And so I guess before we get into this, my first question that I really wanted to throw your way was, because I really want to go deep. I want to go analytical with this one, right? The MCU is the most dominant thing in pop culture right now. Nobody else really cares about anything else unless it's like DC related for whatever reason. And so I wanted to know, like, what were your thoughts going into like seeing, okay, how is Black Widow gonna play out in movies when we've had just 5 months of watching pretty much like, I'm not gonna say excellent quality, but like MCU quality, I'll call it, on television?
Yeah, I was obviously very curious like the rest of us. I think I was more so curious about how the box office numbers were going to do, just because I find that to be pretty interesting, and I think that's like the ultimate test to see if we're truly coming out of the pandemic or not, as far as, you know, people feeling comfortable getting out to theaters and taking quote unquote risks, depending on how you view it. And so with that being said, I think that was always more intriguing to me than this movie, because like I said before, this film in specific always kind of felt like too little too late, almost like a contractual obligation that kept getting pushed to the side. And so I mean, with the lack of marketing compared to what I've been blasted with in the past from DC movies, Marvel movies, it did feel more so like a throwaway. And I think that's why I kind of just Freudian slipped and said DC, because of, you know, just how I feel undervalued this is by Marvel itself. You know, DC gives up on their creators. They give up on their storylines. And you don't really ever feel that with Marvel, barring a few select cases here and there. And unfortunately, this seems to be like one of those. So it was hard to get excited. But it's here, and, you know, we saw a movie, and we'll save our thoughts for a few minutes, but does that about tackle everything you were sort of getting at there? Or?
Just about. It's really interesting because, like, again, you're right. It's for this was originally for the movie that was supposed to be the launching point of Phase 4, right? Originally back before the pandemic kind of threw everything out of balance, right? Phase 4 was always going to include, like, the television side, but, like, the actual official television side that would actually tie in, not like what they attempted to do with Netflix, and that just failed miserably because that was in a different department of things that Kevin Feige probably didn't even know half of the storylines that were going on in those shows. And I always, even before the pandemic threw everything out of whack, I always thought it was really not fascinating, I'll say, but I just thought an odd choice to like be like, okay, of all the movies, Black Widow's going to be the one to kick off Phase 4 when arguably their initial couple of movies that they were going to have come out immediately after Black Widow, because they weren't going to dive. The whole original plan with Phase 4 was they were not going to dive directly into sequel territory. Like, they weren't trying to rush out Doctor Strange and Thor 4 and Black Panther 2, right? They weren't trying to rush those out. They were saving those for the back burner. They wanted to ease people in to like their new characters, right? Which is why we were always going to get the plan was to get Shang-Chi and Eternals relatively quick. But way back when, like, it always kind of fascinated me, not necessarily the decision to put out Black Widow only if for nothing else, only because I understand like kind of the studio trepidations as to why it took so long for this movie to get made. Because as we know, had Kevin Feige actually gotten his way back in the day, this movie would have come out years earlier, probably after Winter Soldier. But because he had to report to what's his name, Ike Perlmutter before reporting to Bob, who that would then report to Bob Iger back when he was running things at Disney. There was just so much different corporate baggage and everything, right? We know obviously that there's been a long kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? A long kind of defiance towards bringing in female-led, more female-led movies and, just bringing in more female characters. Why for the longest time, it took so long for them to get out a female-led movie, right? It's why we had to wait until like 2019 with Captain Marvel for that to be Marvel's first female-led film. But now that they've gotten that out of the way, right, I will definitely say that the reason why I've kind of never bought into the whole this movie should have happened already criticism is because I'm not going to say I'm forgiving of it, but I understood like kind of the corporate mindset that caused it. So as a result, I'm like, okay, yes, I'm fully with everyone. This movie should have happened a lot earlier, like a lot earlier. And so but I just think it's unfair towards the movie itself for the first criticism to be constantly, oh, too little, too late as far as that goes. Because, well, I will say that this is still kind of factoring into some of my criticisms that I've had towards Phase 4 of the MCU. By no means is this a bad movie, I don't think, at least. So, with that being said, kind of as my tidbit, you want to get into our spoiler-free thoughts?
Sure, yeah, let's do it, man.
Yeah. So, Black Widow is a film that they said multiple times. They said, okay, well, obviously, how do you have Natasha Romanoff back if we obviously saw her die in Avengers Endgame? And the reason is because this movie takes place in between Civil War and Infinity War. Not only is it a prequel, but it's a fill-in-the-blanks type of movie. And already off the bat, that's screaming red flags. Because if there's one thing that we kind of the modern-day film audiences have been trained to be like, oh no, towards, the only thing that's worse than a prequel movie is a filling-in-the-blanks kind of a movie, as far as like, oh, there's this gap that we just didn't have time to get to before, so now we're going to retroactively go into it. Usually causes a lot of retcons. It can cause a lot of problems with the pristine continuity as far as that goes. So the film focuses on Natasha Romanoff as she goes on the run after the incidents in Civil War, eventually stumbles onto a series of events that lead her to confront her past, obviously, with her training in the Red Room, and also brings her into direct conflict and alliances with also other figures from her past, which include Florence Pugh's Yelena Belova, Dave Harbour's Alexei Shostakovich, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right, and Rachel Weisz's Melina. I can't remember her last name. It's Russian last names. I apologize. They're really long and they're really hard to pronounce. But, yeah, off the bat, I will say that the first thing that this movie does right is kind of getting into the elements that made certain of the previous MCU movies work so well, right? Because we've talked previously about like the different sects of the MCU, right? We got the cosmic phase, we have kind of the more sci-fi, kind of fantasy phase that like Thor and Doctor Strange are in, and also kind of Black Panther in a sense. And then we have the more grounded, straight up action stuff, like your Captain America movies, your, previously what Falcon and the Winter Soldier did. We have those different kind of sects of the MCU, right? And I think off the bat, what this does is this immediately establishes itself very similar to what the Winter Soldier did as like an action-based espionage movie. And it doesn't stray too far away from that, right? Obviously, there's going to be the fantastical, over-the-top CG sequences, but for the most part, it's pretty grounded. And I think that's the thing that it gets right off the bat. I think those are the parts that are the most compelling. I mean, this goes without saying, but like Scarlett Johansson has played this character for the last 10 years. She knows this character inside and out. She knows how to give the best performance possible for this character. And so I'm not going to say it was refreshing, but it was definitely, for me, the interest for this came from, okay, so this is the first time we're really seeing her on her own and not like being in a team-up movie. So already off the bat, we're getting some interesting things as far as that character goes. And I got to say, I dug it. I love Scarlett Johansson as this character. I think one of the great things that the MCU has done, in addition to its casting, has been their ability to allow these actors to grow with these characters. It really is the first time the first franchise that actually gave actors in films, not on the TV scale, in films, the chance to actually grow with these characters over time, right? And I think that subliminally acting wise, I think that's been really interesting to witness over these last 10, 11 years now. And I think it's on full display here as far as just kind of what she's bringing to the role, how she's kind of like reconciling with her past, and kind of, it works in part due to the fact that this is supposedly her swan song with the MCU. But I don't know, like what are kind of just some of your initial thoughts going into this?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, going into this, it was hard to get past the whole. It felt like a throwaway just because of the way that the studio mishandled it. And I know you said that you don't like that as being the first criticism, but we can only take what we're given.
True.
And we don't have the ability to change that. I mean, I speak all the time on our show about marketing and how important it is, and it's for reasons like this. Once someone has a preconceived notion about something, it's very hard to change that. It's kind of why the court of public opinion is so strong these days, especially with social media. It just exacerbates that mentality, that sort of hive mind mentality that we all have, and so it's difficult to break that. And so I do think that already this had an uphill battle going into it, and so that's why I don't think that's an unfair criticism. If anything, I think it's a criticism that needs to be screamed and shouted, because Disney needs to hear this. I think the reason that this movie has been more of a topic of conversation, not because of its subject matter, but because of the way it's been handled and all that. And I would say all press is good press, but I think at the end of the day, you want the main topic of conversation about your creative piece of art to be about your creative piece of art. And so the fact that it wasn't, I think Disney needs to hear this, because it kind of is unacceptable how they could botch a release of something like this, especially in the MCU. But all that being said, so that is one reason where I disagree with you there, because they were in full control to shift that thought process. The first inkling that they saw of people talking about throwaway online, they could have completely shifted their approach, and they had all the power in the rollout with the marketing to do that. But yeah, I mean, I think when we're talking about the movie in and of itself, it reminds me of The Formula. We haven't seen it for a little while because it's been about a year and a half, but they still have it. They kept it super sealed, airtight. No air got in during COVID. It was chilled at a perfect temperature where the paper is pristine. Like, it's still there. Drag and drop, copy and paste. It's still there. And that's exactly what this movie felt like to me. It wasn't anything special. Obviously, Scarlett Johansson is phenomenal as this character. And, I think obviously she's grown with the role over 10 years, and so of course it's going to be a stunning and brilliant performance. But at the end of the day, it's just, I don't know, it's pretty forgettable. I mean, it felt like watching just like, any one of those like phase 1 movies for the first time, except okay, it had a backdoor pilot for Natasha Romanoff's sister. Cool, I liked her. We'll see where she goes in the MCU. But other than that, man, I see everyone like freaking out and losing their mind about this, and I'm just like, okay, well, this is me being honest.
Yeah, I was about to say, are we going to talk about that IGN controversy that just happened? Because you want to talk about people freaking out and losing their minds unnecessarily over something.
I'm not familiar with it.
So basically, I don't know any names as far as that goes, but there was an IGN critic who actually, wanted to give it a fair review and, not just continually kiss the MCU's ass like everyone else online does. And apparently he was not let go, but apparently he was reassigned to like a lesser known thing, so that like he doesn't have as much of a chance to like flex and like show off his creative skills, just because he didn't have the same opinion as everyone else. So if that's not a demonstration of what you're talking about, I don't know what is, because
doesn't surprise
God
me.
Damn.
I will say, like, the craft is there. I mean, Marvel knows how to put out an action film that hits all the modern beats, because, let's be honest, they set what the action film that hits all the modern beats is. So, I mean, they are the standard, and I think they hit that bar again. But to me, it just felt a little lackluster, and that's upsetting because, like I've said before, Black Widow's been one of my favorite characters in the MCU, probably mostly because of the intrigue and having her be pushed to the side, similar to a Wanda and a Vision, and not really getting to see her fully explored in the way that I think a lot of the fans would have wished up until this moment. But yeah, it's a tough one to sit through because A, it's going to happen. B, we're so far removed from this timeline that it's taking place in, and C, now it's like, even if she is still alive, do I really care? Because I got to see her star in a film where I was bored.
Yeah,
So
it's kind of like I feel like the positives that I could throw that way were like the only positives that I could, because for the most part I'm with you as far as that goes. This at best is like I said, it's a fill in the blank kind of a movie. And I'm sorry, but if the only thing that I come away from after this movie is saying, oh, okay, so this is a backdoor pilot to set up her sister as being the new Black Widow, and oh, that's where she got the hairdo and the jacket and the jet that she's going to use in Infinity War. Like, if this movie's making me say that, that's a problem as far as that goes. Now, that's referencing kind of like what the movie overall does. I will say there are some good moments here that like do have promise, but ultimately at the end of the day, I feel like the reason why I harped so hard on those criticisms is because it does kind of show. It really sucks because, again, if this movie comes out like 5 or 6 years ago when it should have, I don't think we would be having this type of conversation. I think that if anything, back when really that was kind of 5, 6 years ago, that was kind of before the formula really became solidified, because we talked about this a lot. The formula becomes solidified like mid phase 2, end of phase 2, beginning of phase 3. That's when the MCU, that's when like any chance of experimentation for the MCU just goes out the window. And so I feel like if this comes out then, we're having a completely different discussion as far as kind of the impact that this movie could have and on this character, because you're right. This movie, the character is an interesting character. They have a chance to be really intriguing here, ultimately, because the mystery kind of surrounding that character has always been what's kind of driven her and made her such a fascinating force, even as we watched her in, like, kind of, for lack of a better word, sidekick role after sidekick role after sidekick role. We heard all about the Red Room, and we saw flashbacks of the training sequences in Age of Ultron, and all that stuff is really cool if it happens like 5, 6 years ago. But like, the problem is we've already said goodbye to this character. Like, we've already had the emotional heartbeat. Like, we've already had the emotional, like, kind of like letting go. We've already been through that process. So for this to go backwards, sure, it's entirely an issue of placement, and it's entirely an issue of marketing as far as Disney's handling of this movie and why they decided to put this out. But it's just one of those decisions where I'm just like, why? I'm constantly questioning them as far as the decision, as far as that decision making goes. So that's really all.
No, I just want to say one last point before we jump to our next topic. I totally agree with you. It is definitely a script that is begging to come out right after Civil War, and it got deprived of that. I think that while I might be in the minority of film critics who, doesn't fully have, even though I have seen all of the films and, subsidiary properties now that coincide with the MCU, I still don't have like the timeline imprinted in my head like I do, let's say, a Star Wars, or now more so recently like a Fast and Furious, just because I've never really been that engaged. So the fact that I felt like I also had to do some homework, pause it, look stuff up. I actually think I benefited from not going to the theater, just to like refresh myself on the full intricacies of Civil War so I could get the most out of it and bring the most to my review. Today, partly because I'm sick, so I couldn't go to the theaters, but I think I benefited in this situation, oddly enough, because like, I don't rewatch Marvel films when I'm bored or when I'm tired or when I'm just trying to unwind on an afternoon. I don't go back to the MCU for fun, because, to be honest, you guys know my stance. Not that it's been a torturous watch by any means, but they're just other properties that I'd rather go to, especially when it comes down to superheroes. I'd go for something a la The Boys, or maybe even some Snyderverse DC. It's just I'm not putting this on as comfort food. And so, to me, the timing was poor, because I really felt like I needed some index cards. And once I looked it up, and, after the first half hour, and I was like, oh, right, that did happen, this, that, and the other thing. And so, yeah, they're all pissed at each other right now. I forgot all about that. And so now I know what's going on, and okay, cool. I'm along for the ride. But again, timing is everything.
Yeah,
Timing is everything.
it really, really is. As we've kind of gone down this rabbit hole of media and like kind of discovering as far as like, oh, why did certain properties work and certain properties didn't? Timing really is everything. So that's really it for our spoiler-free thoughts. We're gonna get into more of the spoiler-filled movie, and I know this is a movie that, unlike a lot of other properties now, is not available for free. It's still available for the $30 subscription fee on Disney Plus, or only in theaters. So I will say that if you have not seen this movie, definitely duck out now, because I'm not gonna say we're gonna spoil the shit out of this movie, but we're just gonna have a casual conversation about like the rest of it, as far as and spoiler topics will definitely come up. So with that being said, what are your spoiler-free thoughts on Black Widow? If you've seen it, whatever they are, let us know in the comment section below. Be sure to also click the like, the subscribe button as well. You guys know what to do as far as that goes. So now, Chris, I wanted to talk about not necessarily how this compares to the rest of the MCU, because I think we're definitely in like a different beast. We're in a different phase of the MCU now, right? I like to kind of refer to it as like there's the pre-COVID MCU and there's the post-COVID MCU, right? It also doesn't help that like the pre-COVID MCU, I was in like peak MCU like absorption phase. Like I was 11 years old when the first Iron Man came out, and I was graduating college when Endgame came out. So like you've said this before, the MCU hit me personally at like the perfect time. But now I'm in like a different phase of just my life and just my movie watching career in general. And I realized, oh wait, there are like other movies outside the MCU. It really sucks because the majority of people have just seem to have forgotten that there are other movies outside the MCU. But well, the one thing that I noticed first and foremost off the bat about this movie, which, well, I'm probably grasping at straws here, but bear with me for a second, which is that I will definitely say that with kind of Phase 4, and this the majority of properties that I've seen so far from Phase 4, you know, we're halfway through the year. This is already our fourth MCU property that we've sat through within 6 months, which is insane in compared to previous years, because in previous years, again, we would have a movie and then we would have like 2-3 months in order to like rinse and repeat, digest, and get ready for the next one. Like I said, 3 years straight, 2017, 18, and 19, 3 years straight of 3 MCU movies. And at the time, we thought that was a lot. But needless to say, we had no idea. So we've sat through WandaVision, we've sat through Falcon and Winter Soldier, we've sat through most of Loki, and now we've got Black Widow. And the thing that I've seen so far from Phase 4, I know Phase 4 is going to have more properties in it than any of the previous phases of the MCU, but Phase 4 seems to be, for the most part, just kind of catching up and kind of giving the sidekicks that didn't really have the chance to have any characteristics in the previous films, because they were always supporting characters, their mainstay. And I finally realized that 4 properties where I'm like, oh, that's kind of where Black Widow fits in, because it's literally the only place that it could fit in, because every other place, it's like in every other sense, it's completely out of place as far as that goes. WandaVision, all about Wanda and Vision. Falcon and Winter Soldier, Sam and Bucky. Loki, it's in the title, Loki. And now Black Widow, who again has been primarily a supporting character. And if we look forward to the rest of the properties that we're getting for this year, we're finally going to get some new characters, like some origin stories for some characters, right? With Ms. Marvel, Shang-Chi, and the Eternals. And obviously we're going to get the 3rd Spider-Man movie, which again, that's Sony's, that's in a beast in and of itself. But we're also going to get the same thing later this year with Hawkeye. And so I'm like, okay, do we, like, is this what the MCU, like, I don't know, like, I've been having a hard time kind of just wrapping my brain around it and being like, okay, so are we just using this to play catch up in order to, like, get people in? Like, I don't know, like, maybe you can explain this mindset kind of better than I can right now.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. I think, again, we kind of know that it was a contractual obligation due to some of like the Hollywood Reporter style articles that came out that sort of outline the fact that like this movie has to happen unless Disney wants to break contract with Scarlett Johansson, which would be somewhat expensive. Not that they couldn't afford it, but it just also makes sense not to do it because she's an Avenger and it will put butts in seats. We'll see how many, as we're still recording this right now in the middle of the opening box office weekend. And so we don't have hard numbers yet, but I think that is kind of the main reason why it's come out now where it has, just because if this is her true exodus from the MCU, then this has to happen so she can fulfill her contract legally, leave, and her and Disney can be in good standing and leave the door open for future. Like, I just think it comes down to a bunch of red tape. To be honest with you, it's certainly not a creative decision as far as I'm concerned. The creative decision would have been to release it right after Civil War, in between phase 2 and 3, to sort of build up some of that excitement and keep us on that pace that we were climbing towards Endgame. I mean, that would have been, in my opinion, the perfect execution for this film. And obviously, I think it still will be a huge international success. And obviously, here in the States, I think it will make a killing just because it's got the biggest bumper sticker of all time attached to it, right? MCU, Marvel. I mean, everyone's seen it. And it's always in your face, so that's why I use the bumper sticker reference.
It's a good reference.
Yeah, and so I just think, where does it fit in now, to answer sort of the question of this topic? Where does it fit in with the rest of the MCU? I think it fits right in with the rest of the carbon copy, drag and drop scripts. It's got all the beats that you want. It's got the joke to cut the tension of an action moment. It's got the forced family bond. It's got the mission. It obviously falls more towards like the Earth level properties, like the Captain Americas of the world, specifically the espionage feel of one Winter Soldier. But it just hits all those generic beats that, like, you want to go grab a giant ass fucking cup of soda, you want to get the big bag of popcorn, and you just want to be disgustingly loud munching and sipping in a theater. Turn your brain off for a little while and pretend like you saw something groundbreaking. I think it fits perfectly with, I'd say, like 85% of the MCU. They know their audience and they're giving them what they want. And at the end of the day, that's kind of the most important thing you can do for the commerce side of being an artist and a creator. And Disney certainly knows how to do that. So it is, like I always say, like, I can't really hate them anymore. I know I'm being harsh. I'm not being, harsh out of hate. I just personally didn't like the movie, but I can't hate them for the way that they know how to handle their product, especially as someone who's like aspiring to, get into the business side of the creative arts as we grow our show and all that. Like it is something to quite literally marvel at the way that they're able to do it. So,
wow, those Fast and Furious puns really left a bad impact on you.
They forever changed our show.
They really did. They really, really did. It's funny because I even made a note somewhere. I'm really glad that you actually talked about like the business and corporate side of that, because I even made a note somewhere about the director, right? Because I know everyone loves to praise the MCU directors as far as that goes, even though we know, we just know we're not dumb. We know, and this isn't just the case for Marvel. It's the case for like most blockbuster studio movies, which is that most directors are hired hands. It's not. I think particularly anything demeaning. It's just a factual statement. Most directors today are hired hands, and the whole essence of directors really leaving their artistic statement on these giant blockbusters, it's all for marketing purposes. That's all it is. And so I made a note in my review, which I have pulled up here, that I thought was kind of funny, where I'm like, I'm glad Cate Shortland got a chance to at least direct, half a movie, because like, I will say that the parts of this movie that weren't CG-filled action sequences, I still kind of dug. I dug the characteristics. Yeah, the forced family dynamics were forced as they were, but the acting was for the most part good. I like Florence Pugh. It just kind of kills me that Florence Pugh was in 3 movies in 2019, which she gave fantastic performances in all 3, and no one's gonna know who she is until they watch this movie. But that's just the state of things. That's just the world that we live in now. Rachel Weisz is good. Ray Winstone, he's always reliable as a generic stock villain. It's just kind of disappointing because I love that guy as an actor. I also wanted to say, too, I called the Taskmaster twist like 3 seconds before it happened. I've gotten really, really good at that with movies in recent years of just calling twists where I'm like, oh, I know this is, I know what this is. And like, I know the movie is placing the pieces there and the movie wants you to realize it like right before it happens. And then it happens, and I'm like, oh, okay, it's his daughter. That's why they've been constantly hinting at that. But it's funny, too, because I saw this, I saw this rumor that like her contact, the OT Fagbenle character, could potentially be Taskmaster, and I'm like, oh man, if that was the case, that would have been like a real twist, because that guy's just like kind of a joke sidekick character for most of it. That if he turned out to be Taskmaster, I'm like, damn, that would have actually been pretty cool. But it wasn't. They went with kind of the more generic route.
Yeah, that would have been cool.
That would have been awesome.
I looked up a quick headline from Deadline, and it said Cate Shortland didn't want to write a dark film. She wanted to write something fun and inviting to give the character a proper journey. So I think it makes sense why the twist was a little, you could see it coming from
right.
Not a mile away. I don't want to discredit it too much, but you could see it coming.
Right, but I mean, this factors into the story that we heard from this director herself, Cate Shortland, when she was interviewing about the movie, which is that when they were talking to her about the movie, she was like initially skeptical because again, she's like an indie director who's only directed like two or three movies before this, and she's worried, understandably so, about directing the visual effects sequences. And they're like, "Oh, don't worry, we already got that covered." Like they already have the visual effects sequences done before they even bring in the directors in order to do it, which is another part of the reason why the visuals, as time went on, I think it works better in certain movies than others. Why the visuals are always kind of the most like confusing, I'll say, part about these movies is because they're not actually made by the artists. It's the definition of like a corporate structure. Like this isn't like a Zack Snyder Justice League situation where at the very least the visuals in that movie feel like they were done by an artist because of just how much of a visual director Snyder is. But Snyder's just one person, and like
I want to chime in on that point before we get too
do.
far away from it. It's the homogenization of the industry, you know, the need to, I'd say, meet a quota rather than put out a movie or a piece of art, because you can say all you want about Snyder, and I've been pretty open about the fact that he is a modern filmmaker who I understand the hate and I understand the lack of appreciation, but I very much so appreciate his works, because I think for as messy as his trilogy is, his Man of Steel trilogy is what I like to call it, you know, Superman's fighting style is uniquely different than Batman's, which is uniquely different than the Flash's. I mean, they all kind of have, and I'm not talking about like artistic contributions that the world's never seen before, but I am sort of saying that like they have their unique visual stylization, which I think makes when they contribute to, for example, at the end of Batman vs. Superman, right? When they contribute to the big win and everyone's sort of doing their share to get this thing done, I think it makes it all the more special. And with the MCU, it just all kind of looks and feels the same. So I think there's something to be said there.
Yeah, I've thought of so many different comparisons for this, and have quite frankly done them to death. But like, it's the death of cinema. It's exactly what it is. It is the breaking down of the artistic licenses in order to create one streamlined product that everyone loves, but at the same time, it's at the death of ingenuity and individuality. So that's really all that I have to say as far as kind of how this follows with the rest of the MCU. I want to talk about now about Phase 4, kind of, and where this leads us for the rest of, you know, kind of the properties going forward, because oh man, again, we're only just getting started. We've got, for just the rest of this year alone, after this movie and then after the Loki finale this coming week, we've got What If, we've got Miss Marvel, we've got Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, we've got Hawkeye, we've got The Eternals, and we've got Spider-Man, No Way Home, just to end this year. Next year, we've got Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, Thor, Love and Thunder, Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, The Marvels, She-Hulk, Moon Knight, and Secret Invasion. And that's just the next year and a half as far as that goes. Like, I know we've talked a lot about superhero sickness, superhero fatigue in the past, but I wanted to know, like, is this the point where it actually happens or no? Like, the pandemic kind of screwed any chance that we had of, like, people, like, actually wanted to move on from this franchise, and they just, like, want to be completely inundated with it more. Like, it really is a hard time. Like, I honestly need to talk to more people kind of just outside of our circles as far as what it is that they constantly love about this, right? Because the interesting thing that I've seen from this year alone is that obviously, again, because 2021 is dealing with the effects of a 2020, a year with no movies in it, right? So we've kind of transitioned into this year where, because we're dealing with effectively 2 years worth of movies in 1 year, we're just getting like these back-to-back blockbusters pretty much every single week since the movies came back, right? There hasn't been a single week where we've gotten something that isn't like primarily like spectacle based, right? Obviously that plays into exactly what Martin Scorsese was scared about was going to happen with movies, but like we went 3 weeks back to back, like nobody, Godzilla vs. Kong, what's it called? Mortal Kombat, Spiral, Quiet Place 2. Like, I know I'm leaving out a few as far as that goes, but like, you guys get my point as far as that goes. So like, I just wanted to ask you, like, do we get to a point now where what Scorsese talked about, and these are the only types of movies that we see in theaters? Because this movie felt like it, like more than anything else, felt like it fit right into that mold. As far as just like, wow, I feel like I'm seeing like not the exact same thing, but like I feel like I'm seeing like kind of, in a sense, like just it's another like spectacle-filled thing that I'm gonna enjoy in the moment and then forget about like 3 minutes later, you know? And I'm just wondering, I'm like, I know we've been celebrating kind of this return to the movies, but like, is this seriously all that the movies have to offer going forward now?
I mean, I think that it's not a matter of if fatigue has set in. I think it's you either have it or you don't. It comes down to like building up a tolerance to something or like stamina
Damn
to
sure.
something, you know? So I think like me personally, yeah, I have it. And it is what it is. I mean, I'm still finding enjoyment in select properties that really sort of, knock me off my feet, like Loki being so incredibly awesome and refreshing and different and new in a space that is, I think, very oversaturated. I mean, just look at the plethora of films and TV projects that are coming from MCU alone that you just named over the next year and a half, and we know for a fact that DC's ramping up with a soft reboot in the form of Flashpoint, and we're getting a Boys season 3, and Invincible season 2 and 3 has been confirmed. And hey, don't forget about that CW universe; they're still going on. I mean, they're starting to fizzle out now, but they are still going on, and it's just, and then that's not even scratching the surface, because you can go so much deeper and find so many more different shows. Like Superman and Lois just came out this past year, and
Yeah, it did.
and so I think you either have it or you don't. But the problem is, I definitely think Scorsese was right. I was actually going to bring him up at the tail end of last segment, but I figured he'd make his way back into the conversation here, because yeah, he's 100% right. It's where is the art, in my opinion, in having a director come onto a film to only do the sitting around the table scenes? Like, I want her touch on the action. I want to see what she could bring to the machine that is the MCU. But instead, they're kind of either it's training wheels for young directors, or it's, hey, like, this is just what the mouse wants and the mouse gets what it wants. But either way, it's not very artistic, right? Film's a collaborative art form, so you're not allowing your director to collaborate on one of the major portions of your film, which an action film. I mean, action is a lot of the movie, especially in this one. How and not that this is unique to this film, but sometimes, exposition happens in the quiet parts, and then the fighting gets you to the next plot point. In this one, you did have some actual, plot moments happen within the combat. So it's just kind of like, okay, well, so how much of this did she actually do? So yeah, I think Scorsese is right. I don't think he necessarily phrased it the best way possible, but I can totally understand how he feels, because as someone who loves rock music, and it's the reason I became a creator and an artist, seeing how the Grammys prop up these songs by artists like Lorde, who are phenomenal. She's a great singer. I think she writes incredibly weird and just entertaining to listen to music. But rock and roll is built on guitars, drums, and bass. And so if you're nominating an album for a Grammy that has no guitars, drums, and bass, how is that a rock record? And I just feel like that's the music side showing its homogenization, its push towards everything essentially being pop, with just different variations of it to appease the different subsections of the consumer that necessarily might not like Taylor Swift's version of pop. They maybe want something a little darker that they think is rock when it's really not. I think the MCU in film is it's going in that direction. I mean, look, there are still art directors out there, same as there are still true artists out there. But like, there's a difference in the amount of notoriety that like an A24 gets and the impact that A24 makes on pop culture. Even when it has its biggest splashes, it's nowhere near as impactful as like an MCU film, just because of, I think, the stranglehold that they have on the industry. And I just think that this is another example of the industry just slowly more so being pushed into a system, which is unfortunate because it's always been a studio system. But from what I've read and what I've learned through the journey of this podcast, it felt like it was a give and take, like one for me, one for the studio. And now it just kind of feels like, well, hey, if you want to play ball at the next level and have in your movies the big names. And if you want to be a big name in a movie, let's say you're not an actor, you're not a director, you're an actor, this is what you got to do. And we have millions of people lined up right behind you. So if you don't want it, by all means, walk away. We're not going to be hurt if you do this. You know, we will be able to find someone if you don't step up to do it. And yeah, so long story short, Scorsese was right. I don't think that he phrased it the best way possible. I just think that's a generational gap there that would never quite come across the way I think he wanted it to. But if you open your eyes and you take off your blinders, I think it's pretty right there. It's pretty in your face.
I wanted to bring up kind of this last point because I feel like I just feel like I've said all that there is to say about this movie, but I wanted to bring up this last point, which I think is I think a fair question. I mean, we've asked this in general as far as that goes, right? But obviously, because not only Scorsese's spoken to this, but Spielberg's spoken to this as well about kind of the de-evolution of certain franchises, right? Which is that how superhero movies seem to be the new Westerns, which is that for the longest time, the Westerns were the most dominant and profitable genre form in Hollywood for like 50, 60 years. Like they only stopped being profitable in like the late 70s, early 80s. And even then there were still the occasional Western that were thrown out. It was like during the 50s, it was like during the late 50s and 60s. Well, initially during the 30s and 40s when the studios were first coming around. And then later on in the 60s when the spaghetti Westerns saw their huge boom. Like they're just a reliable form of entertainment because it's a very palatable, very marketable, very sellable type of story. It's very easy. It's usually good guys and bad guys. There's usually not a whole lot of moral ground. Of moral gray area, and at the end of the day, the good guys always win, and they always come back for the next time, right? So that people can consistently get that kind of entertainment. So as far as in that sense, as far as kind of superheroes embodying kind of like the modern day kind of Western traditional good versus evil struggle with like kind of a new coat of paint slapped over it, my question is, do we get to the point where superhero movies do go to the way of the Western? Like, do people like finally get sick of it? Do people start to wonder, like, and actually, look into other areas? And I'm not talking like the people like us who like are in these circles and who are constantly looking and constantly begging the question of trying to get, more out of their entertainment. I'm talking like, for lack of a better word, like some friends of ours that we know that like really only care about certain things if they're superhero related, and if they do go to see something else, it's because they're with us, because they're friends with us, as far as that goes. Like, do we ever get to that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do. I don't think we're near there yet, but I do think you're starting to see pushback. You're starting to see early signs of people tuning out. I also think the numbers are hard to read right now, though, because of the pandemic. We know that not everyone is ready and willing to get back into the theater, into the public, to risk their safety. People are adjusting, and everyone's, sort of taking it at their own pace. So I think it's premature to say that we're getting to that point, but everything is cyclical. I mean, Joseph Campbell, in the second half of his hero's journey, when he's done outlining the hero's journey, he goes into what I find is the more interesting portion of the book, which is the Cosmogenic Cycle. And the Cosmogenic Cycle essentially is, just to break it down very simply for you guys here, if you're not familiar with Campbell, because that's a whole nother podcast, but the Cosmogenic Cycle is multiple heroes' journeys that contribute to an overarching history over time. And it's essentially what we've seen with comics, right? There was a Silver Age, there was a Golden Age, but in between then there was lulls. And so basically what Campbell was saying in his study of, the way that we tell stories and the way that we share media, it's things will come and go in waves. And sometimes it takes not just one hero's journey, but multiple heroes' journey to come to an understanding, an awakening, an epiphany. And so I think that we're kind of in the middle of a cosmogenic cycle of the entertainment industry right now when it comes to superhero properties and their impact on the zeitgeist. And we're not, I don't think we're anywhere near sort of going the way of the Western yet. I still think we're in a golden age of superhero cinema. Because of how well these Disney Plus shows have been received, because of how well offshoot properties like The Boys, like Invincible, to name a few, have been received. So I think the demand is still there, but whereas again, the Silver Age ended because comics stopped being sold for a while, and comic creators had to go back to the drawing board to find another way to drum up support and enthusiasm in their product. And same as the gold age of comics also suffered the same fate. Eventually the bubble will burst, right? I mean, it's just the way things go. You can even look at music, like somehow the 1980s are back in pop music again, but it's been 40 years since then. And there was a 35 to 40 year run where no one wanted anything remotely dancey or Phil Collinsy in their music because it ran its course. And now people have figured out a way to take what was good about music back then and add it with what they like about music now. And so it's back in cycle, it's back in fashion. And I just think at some point during the course of our podcast, we will see that cycle run. But for now, I think we are nowhere near the burst of that bubble.
Nowhere near.
Because the last thing I'll raise about cycles and the way things work, as you approach the end of a new cycle, traditionally, when you study these types of things, each one is longer than the next. And so I think that's a part of like building up to that tolerance and sort of like keeping the masses amused with what you're doing at the moment. They slowly become more and more tolerant to higher quantity of the same thing over and over again, aka this MCU formula. So I don't. It will burst though. When beats me. I'm not going to make a guess. I'm not a projectionist or statistician. I'm just here to do a podcast.
Well, hey, you've already like educated me like a lot on as far as just people in general, their mindset as far as these things go. It's just, you know what it is? And I've talked about this before, right? And I figured this out more before as I kind of differentiated myself from the regular people. I'm just like, you've said this before. It's like you hear these people talk about these MCU movies like they're the only things. And I'm like, guys, there are other movies that you watch. And I'll list off like 5 that I saw just recently, and they'll have no idea what I'm talking about. Like I like, what's the word? Like just blank stares. As far as that goes. And I'm just like, at what point do we get where people just, I don't even care if they like watch anything good, if just people watch stuff other than, and just know about stuff, and there are other things in pop culture that they can talk about besides the MCU, you know? Because could you imagine how boring the 80s and 90s would have been if Star Wars was literally the only thing that people talked about? Like, yeah, Star Wars is awesome, but like, part of the reason why the 80s was so awesome is because we also had Indiana Jones and E.T., and Prince's album that dropped, and Karate Kid, and Ghostbusters. I'm really only talking about movies, which I know is a small facet of pop culture, but it's like, there was variety. There were different things there as far as that goes. There wasn't just one thing. That's kind of what we talk about when we talk about kind of the monoculture as far as that goes, and why that's kind of so detrimental to the stuff that we love, because interest in things comes from competition, and it doesn't help if there's no competition. And the MCU has been unchallenged for 5-6 years now, and it makes things boring after a while. It's why I've been so critical of the first couple of MCU properties that we saw throughout this year, because I finally don't have the blinders on as far as, okay, I'm so stuck inside of this bubble as far as I just want to see the end of this journey that we've been on, right? And while I'll still probably be a little less harsh than I should be on the first 3 phases, because I still think that the only thing that I'm willing to give those first 3 phases is the fact that they still did feel like they were part of a story, right? As far as that goes. And but that's the only one that I'm willing to give as far as that goes. Now that we're like kind of in this rinse and repeat cycle like you were just talking about, now the signs are starting to show, and now the story doesn't feel as original because we already saw the end of our first good versus evil struggle, you know? And now I'm ready for a new one, and we're just not getting that. So the only thing that I really have left to ask you before we get out of here is, where would you say, I know that like this is going to be tricky for you in particular, but like where would you say this ranks within the overall MCU for you?
It's like upper middle. It's nothing special, but so much of the MCU is nothing special to me that I love this character so much that I'm willing to give it some points. That's where I'd say it goes.
So you'd say it's right there. I'm trying to think. For me, I believe that I have it because like I have everything ranked post Endgame in like its own category of itself. But for me, this would probably be like lower tier middle, because I actually like Captain Marvel more than a lot of other people. I also love a lot of the Phase 1 movies more than everyone else, because at the very least, even though those movies don't necessarily hold up to like the might of future MCU installments, they still feel like movies to me. So like, I'd probably throw this like right in there with like Incredible Hulk, Captain Marvel, Ant-Man and the Wasp kind of area, where it's not one of my favorites, but it's also not nearly as bad as some of the other ones. It's a competently made action movie that has all of the typical MCU-isms that is just there to set up for future installments. And I think that's also probably a thing as to why these Phase 4 installments are feeling so egregious, is because now for me, both the references to the greater MCU and the setup for future movies is starting to feel so fucking obnoxious and in your face as far as that goes. And we didn't talk about the post-credit scene at all, but like, for that being like the backdoor pilot for like, oh, how Yelena's gonna be in the Hawkeye show and how she's eventually gonna be in the Thunderbolts, and for that fucking cameo, who might be the worst cameo of all time, like, wow, who are you going to replace Sam Jackson with? Julia Louis-Dreyfus. Wow, talk about taking a couple steps back as far as that goes. And I love Julia Louis-Dreyfus, but she's incapable of playing Elaine, except in anything now. Like, even in Veep, which she did 7 seasons for, won 6 seasons for, I'm like, I'm never going to be able to see anything else other than Elaine. And they have her doing this weird fucking, like, halfway, like, partially comedic, partially sarcastic, but, like, we're expected to believe that she's in this position of power. I'm like, it doesn't work. And the minute that comes on, I'm like, wow, that just lowered this movie, like, a couple paces for me. So, final thoughts as far as that goes. Black Widow, I can't say it's a welcome back to the MCU because we've already had 3 MCU properties on Disney+. The placement of this movie is weird. Everything about this movie is weird. It's not the worst movie that I've seen this year or just in general with the MCU. It really sucks because I feel like I'm doing a disservice to Johansson, who legitimately does kick ass in this movie and who is legitimately awesome. I still don't know if I'm entirely sold on Florence Pugh as an action star, if only because, like, it's her initial outing, and, like, we know that these actors always grow within these MCU character roles. Like, we know the MCU casting is not at all one of its problems as far as that goes. I love how we didn't talk about Dave Harbour at all, and that should, you know, he's one of the biggest stars right now that people actually know and talk about as Hopper, and we didn't talk about him at all in this entire podcast.
And I love him, as you know.
Yeah, as we know.
Major Stranger Things fan, so.
And that should tell people everything that they need to know about his use in this movie as far as that goes. It's a generic kind of stock plot that we've seen before, ultimately. So for me, it's a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I know I'm probably being generous, but like, it's not as bad as certain other things that I've seen, but it's also, it's completely forgettable to me, kind of.
Yeah, no, I think you kind of hit the nail on your head with all of your criticisms, and I think it always shows when the conversation is less about the movie and more about situations and possibilities and futures of the industry based on the impact of the movie. I think if a movie was really compelling, predominantly we'd be speaking about the film itself, right? So with that being said, I think I really, including everything else I've said, can't go higher than a 2.5. Just because, like, it's just a little, it's, you know, I've seen it before, and maybe I liked the, Iron Man 2 drag and drop better than this one, or maybe I liked the, you know what I'm saying? I've seen it before, and it is what it is. It's going to have went in my mind. It's not going to be something that I'm going to sit with all weekend and want to go watch again, or even go and when I feel better, catch in a theater. So it's just a 2.5.
Dude, put it this way. Like, I saw this, but by the time this podcast comes out on Monday, it'll have been 5 days since I saw this movie, and I forgot about this movie like a day later. A day later, I was already struggling to remember. I'm like, oh, yeah, what happened there? I'm like, oh, yeah, this happened. I'm like, okay, I remember called the Taskmaster twist, and I remember certain of the action scenes being fun. But, like, even those, like, I felt like, oh, wow, I feel like I'm watching, like, a stock Jason Bourne movie. So, with that being said, that was our review of Black Widow. Sorry if this wasn't, like, you know, the typical, like, you know, just raving and ranting and raving and propping up the MCU that you guys are so used to seeing on the internet, but that's not what we're here to do. We've made that clear from day one that that's not what this podcast is, that's not what we're here to do, right? I've already said my MCU ended with Endgame, and as far as I'm concerned, everything that we've seen so far since, nothing has given me reason as to why the MCU should have kept going, but obviously, I'm in the minority there, so let us know what you guys think. Let us know your thoughts on Black Widow. Let us know if you think the MCU should have kept going. Let us know if any of what we just said about all of this business jargon that we just dropped on our Black Widow podcast makes any sense to you, and if it gives you any incentive in order to try go and do some research into behind the scenes as to how movies are made, because at that point, as we know, that's clearly the more interesting story than, you know, the actual movies that are made, and that should tell you everything that you need to know about the movies that Follywood is force-feeding you. Chris, where can the good people find you online?
Yeah, they can find me the same place they can find our podcast, at Christian Evanko, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Evanko, spelled Evanko. I make music, and I have another podcast, both of which you can find pretty easily through the link in my bio. So copy and paste that into your web browser. I'd love for you to check that out. I promise it's going to be a little something different than what you're used to. But anyways, Dom, what about you, man? Where can they find you?
Facebook and Instagram at Movie Nerd Reviews, but you can primarily follow me posting every single day, twice a day on Facebook and Instagram at the Talkin TV podcast. Thank you guys for consistently continuing to tune in to new podcasts. We're past the halfway point of the year. That is still fucking insane to me that we're halfway through the year. Like, Chris, you texted me a stat earlier today, and
yes.
I'd
love to share that. I wanted to share that, but our
people.
Conversation got very intense in a great way. But I texted Dom today, guys, and I know it's bad form to be on my phone, but I want to get this right. So I texted him. I said, "Hey, man, just checked." Whoops, that's for Black Widow screeners. I said, this time last year we had 29 subscribers and 600 views on YouTube. Just a little perspective check. Haha. That's because of you guys. That's because of you guys.
It's insane. It's insane, and we thank you guys, and we hope that you'll continue to come back and give us more of your attention, because it's awesome, and it lets us continue to make the awesome content that we love making. And you guys can continue to do that by clicking the subscribe button down below, clicking the bell next to the subscribe button, clicking the like button, leave a comment, do all the things that you usually do on YouTube videos that you guys care about so much. And as always, people, remember, we'll be back with more MCU content, because that's apparently the only thing that people actually care about now. 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys.